should we start with what's happening in Syria right now, and then from there we can go into broader sort of the broader Middle Eastern governance topic? Does that sound like a good place to start?
I think that's like an okay place to start there.
Okay, so I actually haven't been following it super closely. What's sort of interesting about what's happened in Syria, or why is that reminiscent of what's happened in sort of some of the Middle Eastern transitions more broadly?
Well, President Assad's government had in theory been fighting to maintain power for nearly a decade, right? That was the beginning of the Syrian civil war when many disparate factions were engaged in the struggle for control of the country. Syria is a very interesting country, and it was a fractious one to begin with. It arguably never quite fully made sense as a coherent single entity. Too small to be an empire, regional hegemon, yet in a way diverse enough that it can fragment into its ethnic components. There's, of course, the underlying tension between the Kurds in the east and the general Arab population in the west of the country. But the Kurdish population speaks a different language, even if they are Sunni Muslim. And then in the west, you have a division between the Sunni and the Alawites, so different strains of Islam, as well as a substantial Christian minority. Among the many political groups that the government had been, the previous regime had been fighting, there was a faction of various factions of Islamists, factions of Kurdish fighters. There were also factions of, let's call them a kind of like a set of rebellious military generals. And in theory, people who were pursuing something that, could be called democratic reform or trying to establish sort of a democratic government. Now, with every rebel group, you have to ask how much is this just presentation and window dressing for the West versus genuine idealism. But, if you have general carry out a coup, promise behind the coup is that, we're just doing this to overthrow the previous corrupt president. And we're going to throw elections 5 minutes from now. The time to start believing the general is when the elections actually, like when the elections are carried out and when they have peacefully stepped down from power, right? Otherwise, it's just rhetorically so easy to say any seizure of power. It's like, actually we're only seizing power to give it away. Right? That's sort of this very easy to say thing. It doesn't really cost you anything. At the end of the day, if your supporters are motivated by something else, betraying that promise politically does not carry that many consequence. So you can probably already tell from how I'm speaking about this that I find the prospect of a stable, unified, democratic Syria unlikely. So fall of the Assad government, in a way, does not change that much for the country, right? The government was only tenuously in control of many parts of it. And, once you lose a few of these cities, you know, Aleppo, Damascus, there's still forces that are fighting sort of on Assad's behalf. And, at the time of recording, it seems like Assad has fled the country. Him and his family's whereabouts are unknown. I think there was a grant, that there was a claim that asylum had been granted to them in Russia. So it's quite possible he'll be making some statements from Moscow soon. But, just because someone's, has been granted asylum, until you actually see where they are and what the situation is, it's deeply unclear. For example, like such an offer might be granted, deal making behind the scenes might result in it being rescinded, or something as simple as like, asylum is granted, but you're still not in the country yet, and you only have promises to get you to the country with asylum. Those promises are then revoked. It seems very interesting to have a head of state survive this kind of government collapse. Now, this has happened before. Here, I'm going to note that when the Libyan government collapsed, Gaddafi, who had been, basically dictator of the country for decades, he was, killed by rebel groups. In the Iraq case, it was a little bit different because the U.S. toppled Saddam Hussein's government. So when Saddam was captured, he was put on trial. And in this case, I don't know what kind of relationship the Russian government will be pursuing with whoever becomes the new legitimate government of Syria, because I think that's profoundly unclear. Now, in theory, these factions have agreed to carry out elections together. Because of what I described earlier, it just takes one rebel group or two to break away from this deal. The civil war continues, even though Assad is gone. So just because you've removed Assad after decades of fractious civil war does not mean that government will happily be stitched back together. And ironically, because Assad is alive, and I'm not here commenting on whether or not he should stand trial. I'm not commenting about any of the human rights abuses, just as a political fact. Because he's alive, this changes the political calculus. In theory, he could continue to wield some amount of influence with the factions in the country. It can be as trivial as, I've stepped down as president of Syria and I recognize this faction as the legitimate government. I wish and support them. I wish them well and I support them, et cetera, et cetera. That very basic gesture of legitimacy could still impact how the political struggle in Syria goes on. Another reason that I'm skeptical of the sustained stability and peaceful cohesion of the country is because of the radically differing visions for the future of it. A high degree of Kurdish autonomy is acceptable to some of the international stakeholders and some of the foreign powers, to be less euphemistic, some of the foreign powers that support various factions in Syria, but it's unacceptable to others. Turkey was a major force and had basically security forces enter Syria, enter it in various regions. They were arming key rebel groups. Turkey has its own political movement, its own Kurdish political movement that has been fighting for and demanding greater autonomy within Turkey for decades. This, went up to including, could be described as low-level insurgency, and can certainly be also described as say acts of terrorism. The Turkish government, of course, have been, significantly merciless in its retribution and its security measures and its oppression in return. To have another Kurdish autonomous region or almost de facto independent region pop up in Syria, where one already exists in Iraq, this sets such a terrible precedent. Those two regions could work together. They could help support the significant Kurdish population in Turkey itself. Kurds are one of the largest stateless people of the Middle East. What do I mean by stateless? I don't mean that they don't have citizenships. There just is no such country as Kurdistan. They are minorities, large Arab countries such as Iraq, or minorities in Iran, minorities in Turkey. And, their language is distinct of all of these languages. So there's no easy sort of natural fit for an alliance based on cultural or national lines. To flip this over, they're operating on basically a version of nationalism. And that actually means that they're better organized and more efficient as a fighting force than their numbers would suggest. So because of this, internationally, every time when a country like Iraq, Iran blows up, they are a natural group to address. There will be a highly organized movement, basically motivated by this dream of an independent country, or at least an autonomous region, where, their language and culture and traditions and history, the one that's prominent. The arguments they have are basically self-determination arguments. It's like, okay, we live here with the majority. Why carry out a referendum? The independence with more legitimacy is pretty solid. And this can still, there can still be reasons that groups are not acceptable. But they essentially have what it takes to motivate people to fight. And this brings me to the second group that has what it takes to motivate people to fight. I'm talking here about Islamist groups, right? You have a very basic argument. This ideology says that it's your duty to fight the non-believers. It's your duty to try to establish a religious and godly government. And this is actually mandated that you should do it. So, someone should, try to declare themselves caliph. And you can have like moderate versions of this ideology, or you can have extreme versions. And extreme versions have popped up. Again, ISIS is a major force in the Syrian civil war. People forget this. Before the first Trump administration, basically with a significant change of policy and ironically even some escalation of Russian support for the Syrian government and other factions, it's ended up resulting in ISIS being defeated. Something like ISIS could rise, and ISIS was very good at fighting, and Kurdish groups, again, that want independence or significant autonomy and devolution of power from the center up to including having their own armed forces, right, and maintaining those armed forces. That level, by the way, of autonomy is not acceptable to almost any government. It certainly is not accepted in any Western country, right? Say, imagine how strange it would be if Quebec separatists were like, well, we don't want full independence, but we'll be happy with the Quebec army as distinct from a Canadian army. The only way this makes sense is if you know that there's such a low level of trust that they want their own armed forces for protection from oppression from the central government, or they're viewing this as an intermediate step to when later the military situation is more favorable, have the means to enforce, whether the central government agrees it or not, their independence. So, okay, you have these two fighting forces, two big ideological drives, each of which transcends the clannish sort of tribal structure that is sort of the default social structure in the Arab Muslim Middle East. And the great thing to consider here, sorry, not the great thing, but the notable thing to consider is that the success of neither of these factions can really result in a stable government. Like, I think a straight up Islamist government would not be completely acceptable, either Turkey or Israel or the United States. So they would have to, or they would want to intervene. For ideological reasons, I also think the Islamist government would be anti-Western, even if it doesn't make geopolitical sense. Honestly, if you look at Iran geopolitically, it kind of doesn't make sense that it is in such a constant struggle with Israel. For ideological reasons, if you imagine in Iran saying, okay, we need to have a rapprochement with Israel, we need to have peace, this sort of decade-long proxy war and harassment has not advanced any of our geopolitical interests. It would just not sort of fly. Ideologically, it kind of like wouldn't work. And it would cause Iran to sort of have to give up this pretense that it's a wave of the future, that the Islamic revolution has relevance not just for the Shia Muslims of Iran, Sunni Muslims of the Middle East. The sort of anti-Israel positioning is kind of this linchpin of a very strange ideological alliance between Sunni Islamists and Shia Islamists, the Shia Islamists being sort of arguing the gap is not so great, and that, oh, maybe you should have been reconsidered this whole Sunni Shia thing in our favor. Like maybe they even have something like a very long-term perspective towards religious conversion, which, it sounds unusual if you're not in the religious mindset, but within the religious mindset, people will constantly be thinking, right? Like the correct metaphor here might be, of course, the methods of, say, I don't know, evangelicals in the United States evangelize and to spread their religion, their peaceful means. There's a religious motive to spread your particular view of things. And Islam does have that, right? It is sort of there that you are supposed to be bringing people to God in that way. So because of that, because, Iran is still a theocracy, I wouldn't be shocked if they carry such um, some way irrational attachments. And I say irrational because mass conversions in the Middle East to Shia Islam from Sunni Islam seem very unlikely, partially again because of the language and national and cultural gap between the Iranian world and the Arab world, right? Where the two languages, in the Iranian world, it's much more than one language, of course. Still, there's an incompatibility there. Culturally, socially, there's not the same identity.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. What does the future hold for business? Ask 9 experts and you'll get 10 answers. It's a bull market. It's a bear market. Rates will rise or fall. Inflation's up or down. Can someone invent a crystal ball? Until then, over 38,000 businesses have future-proofed their business with Netsuite by Oracle, the #1 cloud ERP, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, and HR into one fluid platform. With one unified business management suite, there's one source of truth, giving you the visibility and control you need to make quick decisions. With real-time insights and forecasting, you're peering into the future with actionable data. When you're closing the books in days, not weeks, you're spending less time looking backwards and more time on what's next. Whether your company is earning millions or even hundreds of millions, NetSuite helps you respond to your immediate challenges and seize your biggest opportunities. Download the CFO's Guide to AI and Machine Learning for free at netsuite.com/102. That's netsuite.com/102. netsuite.com/102.
Let's talk about scaling digital commerce for a moment. When Mr. Beast launched Feastables, he faced a challenge of scale. How do you build an e-commerce infrastructure that can handle millions of concurrent shoppers, process transactions instantly, and maintain stability during massive traffic spikes? The answer turned out to be deceptively simple: Shopify. Here's what's particularly interesting from a technical perspective. Shopify has built what's become the #1 checkout platform on the planet. They've created a system called ShopPay that's solving one of e-commerce's biggest challenges: cart abandonment. The data shows it's boosting conversions by up to 50%. If you're into growing your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling. On the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between, everything's unified in one robust platform. It's a perfect example of how infrastructure, when done right, becomes a competitive advantage. Upgrade your business and get access to the same checkout system that powers Feastables. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/acognitive, all lowercase. Nobody does selling better than Shopify. So visit shopify.com/cognitive today. Shopify.com/cognitive.
So let's look at alternatives. Syria was already held together by a secular Arab nationalism. So that's where you take the Sunnis, and you take the Alawites, and you take the Christians, and you say, we all speak Arabic, we are all Arabs. And we are building a state that's not anti-religious, mosques, churches, all of this is fine. We should be close to God. We believe in God, but we're an Arab state first. And this type of Arab nationalism, in theory, could be compatible with democracy. But in the Cold War and after, we usually saw it evolve into some sort of hybrid autocratic system. And for a variety of reasons, the Christian minorities in most the Arab countries where the Christian minority is significant support it. Because again, the alternative is Islamism. Under a political Islamist God, let's say, I don't know, if the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt were to govern, or if ISIS, more extreme version, if ISIS were to win, hypothetically, in a country like Iraq or Syria, you would have a truly awful time as a non-Muslim minority. That group has been demographically shrinking for the last few decades, right? So the Christian minorities of the Middle East have been becoming smaller. Every time there's a major war and minorities tend to flee, their demographic reserves reduced, making their position more precarious. They tend to also settle and assimilate in the Western world, and honestly, even in Latin America, much more easily than the Sunni refugees. So fewer of them would even consider returning. Like if your life is better, you don't feel endangered, in a sense, you're no longer a religious minority, or at least you're not unique in being a religious minority, and you're much richer, sort of the argument for going back to Syria, to Lebanon, or to Iraq, or minor. That's right. There's sort of very much aspects of sentimental attachment. So what we're dealing with in this demographic, also on net, Christians tend to be more secularized in places like Lebanon and Syria and tend to have lower fertility than the majority. Now, we have discussed radically falling birth rates around the world. And it is true that these are falling in a lot of the Middle East. However, since Syria has been so impoverished by the civil war, it was not very rich to begin with. Again, similar to Iraq and similar to Libya, these places still do have a pretty high fertility. So the fertility differentials matter immensely and change the composition, demographic composition of a country for the decades. In a way, these demographic factions, it's not like automatically just because you're Christian, you tend to support the more nationalist government, or just because you're Sunni Muslim, you're going to side with a force like ISIS. It's just that there is a demographic maximum as to what fraction of the population can be recruited or integrated politically, right? So the way what I'm describing here is almost a demographic and political and ideological jigsaw puzzle. How do you piece together Humpty Dumpty? I think the answer is you just can't. I think Syria cannot quite exist as a fully unified state. And it's going to be in this very crippled situation. I mean, over time, and this is kind of unfortunate for the minorities like the Druze or the Alawites or the Christians in Syria, probably it'll just be Sunni Arab. Because over time, as the longer the violence lasts, the more that violence is, the more they experience political violence. The smaller the groups are, the less capable they are of militarily defending themselves, even with militias being a fighting force that's worth protecting or dealing with. I think you might result in just like most in Arab and Sunni population in the West, and a self-sortition between the regions where Kurds live and the regions where Arabs live. So that is a phenomena similar to what happened in the breakup of Yugoslavia, right? Where because people are fleeing danger and because people are pursuing the few spots that are peaceful, that have economic activity, that you might see a sort of self-sortition into different regions of populations who are previously living side by side, now live in different parts of the country. I think that foreign support has proven unable to sustain the Assad government. So what do I mean by this? It was opposed by the West. It was modestly supported by Russia. So fall of the Assad government is a loss for the Russian government. It was supported by Iran. This is a loss for Iran. Hezbollah has already been sort of crippled immensely in its fight with Israel. So I think Israel on net, assuming Syria is not destabilized, let's say it's a modest win, but it's a very complicated win. I don't know if you heard Israel moved to secure the Golan Heights.
Down here.
So it's a fairly important position, and they've moved into like a few other border Syria positions to basically secure what they perceive as potentially an endangered territory. But to be realistic, it also is perhaps a desire to hold that territory in the long run. I also think Turkey might have some territorial aspirations towards Syria as well. Now, this is usually probably done just through like an occupation of a small part of the country or region. It's not going to immediately be like annexation, because in international law, that's just very tricky. But this likely means that whatever government comes, the dominant government in Syria, after, and I do kind of expect these deals to break down, like the deal I mentioned between the various factions in the aftermath of Assad's ousting from power. They will be in a conflict. They will be stuck between Turkey and Israel. That's sort of the best case. So the country is going to have a hard time developing anyway. Now, under those conditions, I just, what exactly is the government can offer? It can't quite offer development. It can't quite protect its borders. Perhaps it has to lean on some sort of ideological backbone. So I think the default is some sort of let's call it moderate Islamism, which might be compatible with democracy in the West, that has constant like geopolitical tensions and foreign entanglements, and then some sort of autonomous Kurdish territory in the east, where even if Turkey tries to intervene, I think the Kurds will fight quite strongly. There are still forces and countries that would oppose Syria just becoming a de facto Turkish puppet state. You could, for example, have Turkey support the most moderate form of Islamism as long as it was a pro-Turkish government and allowed this continued stationing of Turkish troops inside of Syria. Erdogan does have some ambitions for sort of neo-Ottomanist policy where they have a near abroad, where they can intervene and secure their interests. Now, of course, this goes against Israel's interests. That's why I sort of say that, Israel and Turkey are not actually on good terms, even though, they're both notionally in some way Western allies, though in each of their cases, they have strong independent interests, right? Turkey is technically a NATO member, but I think it's fair to say that the least reliable NATO member and like the least likely to follow the policy of the other countries, right? And, Israel is not a NATO member, but it's a close ally of the United States. However, would Israel pursue a foreign policy in the Middle East that was detrimental to the US? Of course it would, right? Of course it would. It has like imminent security concerns. There in fact is also an Israeli national ideology, right? This whole point of the country is a national self-determination as well. And, that's part of why, in a way, Israel is a strong Western style country. I think Turkey, for Middle Eastern standards, is a relatively strong Western style country because people have basically a nationalist ideology as well, which is why accepting, say, Kurdish autonomy is so difficult. Like from a Western pluralistic perspective within Turkey, say, accepting minority status of the language of Kurds, we don't even realize this opens the can of worms for all other minority groups that officially basically don't exist in Turkey, right? And then it asks the question, so what is Turkey about? If it's not about the Turkish language, culture, and development, well, maybe the answer is Islamism. Or maybe the answer is it's us great power. Or the answer is, oh, it's a special economic zone or something. I mean, I'm kidding a little bit. But I think economic growth tends to not be the thing that builds state capacity. Economic growth can come later, can buttress an already working state and support it, right? And offer political alternatives. And I think also economic growth is a prerequisite for functioning democracy, because I think in a low growth economic situation, it becomes a zero-sum game. It's just a game of collecting enough votes to expropriate the side that's not voting. Only with economic growth do you make it be a positive gain, and then you can vote for things that, the whole population wins on, right? Rather than just redistributing directly or indirectly between various groups. And even seemingly neutral things, like, for example, in a multi-ethnic but slow-growing, underdeveloped country, lavish funding of the military or infrastructure funding that's focused on one part or the other part of the country, these are things that will be seen as redistribution, even if they're not, right? For example, it might be a richer region of the country that says, so nominally the same laws apply across the country, but only one region is sort of rich enough to hit particular tax brackets in practice. So in practice, there's one region that pays most of the taxes. These kinds of problems are tricky and thorny to solve without simple, legitimizing political formulas. And, for better or worse, nationalism remains a simple, legitimizing political formula. It's an interesting question why Arab nationalism has never quite worked. And I think one of the big reasons is that none of the individual Arab states can really represent what they could argue that they represent, this full Arab nation. That honestly is like always a hypothetical exercise, right? Just as Germany was a hypothetical exercise before the unification, of most of the German states. You can talk about cultural affinity, but no individual state receives the full legitimacy that a unified Arab state would. Now, of course, the unified Arab state has this big geopolitical problem where if you wanted to unify, North Africa in the middle and, the Arab Peninsula, the Fertile Crescent region. Well, first off, a few countries in the way. Israel exists and will continue to exist. Geopolitically, that's kind of awkward. And it would, if it continued to exist, it would have to be some sort of client state to what would amount to a very big regional superpower, even if it was still a very poor and underdeveloped one on net. It wouldn't even be that poor, right? If you imagine the oil wealth is integrated there. Big gap in wealth between Arab countries is also a big reason that they have difficulty unifying. However, from the Saudi or the UAE perspective, unification with a place like Syria or Iraq just means massive expenditures to try to develop them, right? And there were several attempts for some of these peripheral states to unify during the Cold War, temporary mergers between Egypt and Syria or Syria and Iraq. And these tended to last for a few years at a time before they broke down for basic reasons like they couldn't agree where the new capital should be. Should the capital be in Damascus? Should it be in Cairo? There's been just such a long history of failure of pan-Arab nationalism that it is withered as a political force. And that sort of is why often Islamism has arisen as an alternative, which is sort of like our unifying factor now is that we are all Sunni, and this is a religious duty, and it doesn't matter how strong Islamic State is, I'm supposed to support it, right? It's not a pragmatic decision of, do I believe the Assad family will reunify all of the Arab people, or do I believe Saddam Hussein will unify all the Arab people? It's more, I'm following this government. It's the religious duty of other Sunnis. I will remind them peacefully at first and then militarily, right? And I'm going to exert myself as an individual, as a military unit in service of this. So there is definitely the case that political projects over time can become discredited just by repeated failure. And in fact, one of the strongest forces against Islamism was the defeat of ISIS. The defeat of ISIS in the early 2010s dealt it a massive blow that has been significantly undone by the collapse of the democratic government in Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan is not part of the Arab world, but almost everything I've said about the Arab world, demographic fragmentation, difficulty of crafting a secular ideology for an impoverished country that actually has a reason for a country like Syria or Afghanistan in particular to exist and be legitimate, rather than say, I don't know, maybe there should be Pashtunistan, there should be a state for the Pashtun people only in Afghanistan, right? Or maybe the Turkmen people in Afghanistan want to break away, et cetera, right? It's harder to come up with a story for why that secular government should exist. And the Taliban have a pretty simple story. We are the Islamic rightful government, our lands, right? And that why should it stay unified? Because there are no other Islamic governments around us that are Islamic in the right way. We only have those Shia heretics and their bad fake Islamic republic over there in Iran. And these other governments are secular, godless governments. We're not going to go wage war with them. We're seeking to develop here. We're the only ones with legitimacy to govern these territories. So in a way, the Taliban just had easier job establishing their legitimacy. Because you can say that, but isn't it automatically legitimate? Democracy is in fact the strong ideology of legitimacy. Most people voted for the government. Well, the Taliban can have elections too. And, they might have laws, constitutional limits on who can run in elections, but that's not unique. And Iran is a very interesting example, actually, of a hybrid system of legitimacy where it's both theocratic and democratic. But even women can vote, even stand to be elected into parliament in Iran. And this is something I think in the West we don't think about. We assume Western-style democracies, liberal democracies, have like a monopoly on using, in a purely realpolitik sort of way, the legitimizing and stabilizing power of elections. But hybrid systems, non-democratic, and honestly Islamic democratic systems can use it just as well. Because if those ideologies are popular, I'm not even sure the Taliban would need to cheat if they threw a fair election in Afghanistan. Like, I think they just win it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we talked about this in a lot of detail. I didn't leave a lot of room for questions, but I'd love to dive in whatever part you think is most interesting.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. There are over 1.5 million nonprofit organizations in the United States and millions more around the world. How do you know which ones can make the biggest impact with your donation? GiveWell was founded to help donors with that exact question. They pore over independent studies and charity data to help donors direct their funds to evidence-backed organizations that are saving and improving lives. GiveWell has now spent over 17 years researching charitable organizations and only directs funding to a few of the highest impact opportunities they've found. Over 100,000 donors have used GiveWell to donate more than $2 billion. Rigorous evidence suggests that these donations will save over 200,000 lives and improve the lives of millions more. GiveWell wants as many donors as possible to make informed decisions about high-impact giving. You can find all of their research and recommendations on their site for free. You can make tax-deductible donations to their recommended funds or charities, and GiveWell doesn't take a cut. If you've never used GiveWell to donate, you can have your donation matched up to $100 before the end of the year, or as long as matching funds last. To claim your match, go to givewell.org and pick podcast and enter Econ 102 with Noah Smith and Erik Torenberg at checkout. Make sure they know that you heard about GiveWell from Econ 102 to get your donation matched. Again, that's givewell.org to donate or find out more. Hey everyone, Erik here. In this environment, founders need to become profitable faster and do more with smaller teams, especially when it comes to engineering. That's why Sean Lenihan started Squad, a specialized global talent firm for top engineers that will seamlessly integrate with your org. Squad offers rigorously vetted top 1% talent that will actually work hard for you every day. Their engineers work in your time zone, follow your processes, and use your tools. Squad has front-end engineers excelling in TypeScript and React and Next.js ready to onboard to your team today. For backend, Squad engineers are experts at Node.js, Python, Java, and a range of other languages and frameworks. While it may cost more than the freelancer on Upwork billing you for 40 hours, but working only 2, Squad offers premium quality at a fraction of the typical cost, without the headache of assessing for skills and culture fit. Squad takes care of sourcing, legal compliance, and local HR for global talent. Increase your velocity without amping up burn. Visit choosesquad.com and mention Turpentine to skip the waitlist.
It is fascinating. I mean, one background question I ask is like, if you were advising, sort of U.S. foreign policy, whether it comes to Afghanistan or it comes to Iraq or sort of the, whatever powers were sort of enabling sort of the Arab Spring, like based on what we know now, a couple decades into the future, what advice might you have given or what sort of insight was missing?
I think that for a variety of reasons, maybe the British were at a good point in preferring Arab monarchies, Arab republics. For a variety of reasons, they seem to be more stable and work better. You have basically completely secularized countries where you have a constitutional monarchy. Like, for example, places like Morocco work fairly well and are relatively stable. You want to support such governments if possible. Now, you want to, of course, encourage democratic reform, since the British were, after decolonialization, they were supporting things like the Iraqi monarchy, the Egyptian monarchy, and those didn't really withstand the modernizing pressures and the ideologies, such as the various socialist ideologies that were popping up, nationalist ideologies that were popping up there. The monarchy has this interesting feature where they only claim rule over particular lands. It's like, okay, my dynasty, my family, we have been ruling Morocco for 300 years, or my dynasty has been ruling this part of the Arab Peninsula for like 400 years. We've been the protectors of Mecca and Medina for this whole time. It's a much harder claim to say, oh, and we are now seizing Syria. Historically speaking, legitimizing reasons were found, for a variety of reasons. I think internationally, the US has played its role in stabilizing these borders. So you kind of want governments that can legitimize rule over like fairly limited pieces of territory, even if there's no inherent logical reason to only rule that small piece of territory rather than a larger, more geographically, ethnically, religiously, ideologically coherent or complete whole, right? So I think that this sort of subtlety there might be that supporting rebel groups because they promise democracy does not mean that they will be capable of it. Supporting a political family that has something like for example, a royal style claim power, conditioning your support on them introducing more and more democratic elements. I think that could work really well. There are limits here. You can't actually make such a deal with a family where it's sort of a semi-hereditary dictatorship, right? In Libya, Gaddafi was said to be succeeded by a son. In Syria, of course, Assad's father was already president of Syria. It was almost this kind of a hereditary-ish dictatorship because they derive their power from notionally the democratic element. So it's sort of like if you're asking someone who bases their power on the pretense of democracy to introduce democratic elements, those will directly undermine and remove their role in society, leaving them with no source of power whatsoever. It's not even clear their property. Like, could the Assad family have been, hey, we're just going to let the Islamists be in charge and we're going to be private citizens and we're going to keep our wealth? The rule of law is not strong enough, even if you gave them amnesty for whatever corruption charges. Like, you could easily, in a more developed country, have a deal where, okay, we're actually not going to touch these properties and we're going to transition into a democracy, and certain properties will be respected and will remain family property, and we're not going to try to hoard you that they were stolen and so on. The transition from the Francoist regime in Spain to democracy, deals of this type were onward, right? Including in the Spanish monarchy, the Franco family kept titles that they were given by the King of Spain. So Spain evolved towards a constitutional monarchy out of the Francoist regime. And that was basically on the initiative of the monarch, because the monarch was uninterested in running, we could call it a fascism adjacent government, right? And felt it would be much better for the royal family to just be sort of a pampered, not purposeless, kind of elite family influence, right? They wanted, in other words, to have a cushy position like that of the royal family in the UK. At the end of the day, if you could credibly internationally offer to the House of Saud that, hey, what if you just relaxed? What if you didn't have to worry about being murdered? You don't get to chop anyone up with bones. You don't get to saw their bones. You don't get to kill them. They don't get to kill you. You still have the most prestige in the country. Business of running the country will now be reliant on the civil service and a functional parliament. Looking from the perspective of a royal family, that kind of slow abdication of power, it's not even a bad deal, right? At least if the alternative is instability. So, but to make a deal with an influential family, and I do mean families here, or just in individuals, because even in the Western world, it's often the case that matters. In the Arab world, it remains much more central to life, and the concrete tribes that are associated with the family still matter. Like Saddam Hussein, his last loyal supporters were often people from his home tribe, right? From the extended tribe that his family was a part of. And those were some of the last strong supporters of the previous regime. So all this is to say, identifying centers of non-democratic power, not those who merely have an authoritarian state that claims to be democratic but isn't. So don't take those who have based their legitimacy on a false or sometimes true claim of democracy introduce more democratic elements. Approach others. Let's put it this way. Identify 50 of, the most influential and respected clerics in Syria, bring them together, bring them in a Congress, ask them to declare certain Islamic factions illegitimate and un-Islamic, promise to physically protect them, promise to physically protect their property, promise them some special carve-outs for like how Islam will be practiced in the new Syria, ask them to say it's a religious duty to support the legitimate government that you've picked. Okay, their basis of power individually is not democratic. They lose nothing of their religious power. In fact, they might gain power. A cleric might gain power because they're not a military commander of an extreme ISIS-like faction, right? They just kind of have a congregation, basically. So they might be like thinking to themselves already as like, okay, I will be allowed to tell people how they should vote. Like that's like very basic. Like you might promise them a favorable and prominent position in the religious, in democratic politics of the new system. Or you might seek out wealthy business owners, right? Or you might seek out the royal families of these countries. And I would put actually, so okay, I guess what I'm saying is pretty much, you should actually be pursuing, if you're trying to change the politics of the countries to over time come to resemble Western parliamentary democracy, you should be pursuing an elitist path to reform, not a populist one, because the populist one will too easily be redirected into either extreme nationalism or extreme religious movements. And those will tend to undermine the integrity of those states, the territorial integrity, and leave the door open to war. Truly, like for Syria, this civil war has been absolutely devastating. The country's population is vastly lower by many millions of people than it was when the war began. Many refugees who currently are living in Turkey, many more who also live in Europe. And many of those will never return, some of them will. But, Syria was on track to become like a demographic giant, maybe with 70 or 80 million people. And then this civil war has sort of like, resulted in a Syria that I think will be lucky if it has 40 million people by the end of the century.
And is the dysfunction that we've alluded to in this podcast, is this unique to the Middle East? Like, does what happened to sort of what you were saying about, autocratic governments doing the best, is that also true in, let's say, Africa or something? Or how do we compare what happens in Middle East governance-wise to other places, other regions?
I think that in Africa, actually, there are parts of Africa where something similar is true. I do think Islamism makes continued bids as a valid organizing ideology against established government in places like Nigeria, right? Like you see outposts of ISIS or self-proclaimed outposts of ISIS among African Islamist groups, and a country like Nigeria might still be split apart on those lines. There are few large, linguistically and culturally unified groups like, say, the Kurds that are, don't have a state where they feel relatively dominant in Africa. But that's not because there's so much, not because the states are homogenous, but because the groups are so divergent that you would have truly tiny states. Like if every language or every ethnic group in Africa got its own state, the UN would probably double or possibly triple in size. That would mean another 200 or so smallish states with just a few million people each, most of them landlocked, right? So in a way, in Africa, I think also, while tribal structure is important, I think clan structure is less important. So I think the family cohesion that results in this political organization of the Middle East, I think it's lessened in Africa, so it's important. The local tribal authorities there are much more like almost communal, right? There's this like village here of social organization where a village might have relatives or might not have relatives. And there's going to be like a level of local representation. Like optimistically, you could say that maybe in the very long run, this trends towards something like peaceful transfer of power through democratic means. As optimistically, pessimistically, you might say this predisposes African countries towards sort of socialist politics, because by default, the assumption is that most property should be communal and that all should benefit from it. And this is very different than the idea of, oh, our clan should own property. Like, you're not going to be that in favor actual communist policies at the end of the day. If your basic organizing principle isn't something like the Communist Party, it's more like, well, it's the Ba'athist Party, but we all know which families are in, which families are out, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So for Syria versus Africa, we should also remember that I think the literacy rates are, despite everything, much higher in many of these countries than they are in a lot of Africa. So the appeal, in a weird way, perhaps Africa will see the emergence of extremist ideologies when literacy is high enough in all of Africa. Because until literacy is high, the appeal of something like language-based nationalism is pretty limited, or the appeal of even a thorough understanding. Like, you might not even know what the Quran says, actually, or you might not know what the Bible says if you're illiterate and you're just participating in like traditional religious life. And you're certainly not going to develop your own unique and strange opinions about it. So in other words, I think there's a minimum level of education that results in the kind of religious problems that 16th century Europe saw, that, maybe the modern Middle East is seeing. Referring to the wars of religion, and, when people start reading their holy religious texts, interesting things happen. Not always good, not always bad either, but, I think it is what it is. I think in Africa, people usually talk about foreign powers intervening in Africa, but I'm just going to say that geopolitically, it's kind of a backwater compared to the Middle East. Yes, France has its interests there. Yes, the Russian Wagner mercenary group tries to make a profit by providing, military services or backing certain governments in exchange for mining rights. Yes, China is developing ports and trying to increase trade, and China will protect its investments and interests in the east of Africa. Yes, there's a vested interest by Western powers and by, honestly, moderate and stable Arab governments to suppress Islamists and Islamist success in the Sahel region. But once you say all of these things, you realize there is no country in the world outside of Africa whose political and economic security depends on Africa. So there are no countries developed countries with an existential claim in Africa that must protect their existence, where their existence is endangered, like it might be for Israel. Countries like Turkey, where they have to balance European, Russian, and Middle Eastern politics to stay relevant. Which country in the world existentially endangers South Africa? No one. Right? There's no government that is almost inherently an enemy of South Africa today. Or Kenya is perhaps in a more tricky position. Ethiopia is perhaps in a trickier position because it's on the cusp of falling apart. So if there is an area of Africa where I think all of what we just discussed does apply, it is the Horn of Africa region. So Ethiopia, Somalia, Somaliland, that region is honestly, including Sudan, is best modeled as just part of this politically extended Middle East. But if you go further south below the equator, I honestly predict some of these pretty large states, they're going to stay coherent and they're going to stay fairly unified. A lot of them are pretty low population density. It is the one part of the world that has a rapidly growing population. But low population density actually means that power is relatively concentrated in the few large population centers that exist, right? A truly vast territory with many millions of people that is however highly dispersed, has very little effective military power. Once many of these local villages over 50 years become giant metropolises and country might have 5 or 6 major urban centers that have nothing to do with each other, and where none of those major centers truly dominates the other, well, then you might see, again, some amount of war. So, again, part of what is true in a lot of the Middle East is that there are few places that are absolutely dominated by a major city, the way France is by Paris or London by England. And I think that also gets in the way kind of full political coherence of a lot of them. And I think Africa, once it develops many large cities, at least in some countries, this will result in breaking up. And I would especially predict that that will end up happening most in West Africa, where the population density is very high already, and the states are already small enough. Meanwhile, in Southern and Central Africa, I expect the larger states to sort of remain coherent. And at that point, they will have existed for, 100 years since the end of colonialism? That starts to be enough to develop a distinct national identity as Namibian, Tanzanian, or Kenyan, Ugandan, right? At that point, this has been all that they have known for generations. No one remembers the pre-colonial or the colonial era, passes from living memory. And so the ideas of like different possibilities, like that leaves the space. Also, Africa, unlike the Middle East, has a viable tool for its integration, right? The African Union makes some amount of conceptual sense geographically and economically, and arguably even ideologically, right? So I think that might be an alternative to pursuing nationalism. Might be, well, us Hutu and us Tutsis, we share Rwanda together, and we're keeping this country stable, and we're developing not just this country, we're developing all of Africa, maybe East Africa, and we are participating in this larger community. People underrate the stabilizing effect of something like the African Union or the European Union. One aspect, though, in which I'm pessimistic about the African Union is the European Union exercised far more influence on Eastern Europe before Eastern Europe was a member of the European Union, because they could set standards and conditions for those countries to join. So those countries would self-transform politically and economically and legally to be able to fit into the EU.
Yeah.
And Africa just gave everyone membership to begin with. So I think the actual African Union won't be the African Union, but might be something like the East African Federation. And also to say one more thing, Africa is not unique in being a geopolitical backwater. Most of Latin America is also a geopolitical water with very stable borders and like few existential issues for any of the great powers of the world. So maybe a different way of saying what I said is, if your continent has no great power, it's in pretty good shape, because no one has the power projection ability to mess with you, and no foreign great powers are truly trying to intervene, because no one on your continent is an existential trouble for you in any sense. Like if hypothetically Brazil became a superpower, China and the US might have an interest in messing with Brazilian influence in Argentina or Peru or other countries, and then those countries might become unstable. There might be wars fought there. Okay, sorry, just that's how I would sort of draw that analogy.
No, it's great context. I want to be mindful of time. So I'll just segue to, is there anything we haven't yet discussed on this topic that you think it's important for our listeners to know, or any way you'd want to sort of summarize some of the thoughts that we've been discussing here?
Don't try to forecast which rebel group is going to win. All of these things will be determined in backroom deals between the local powers of the Middle East. And you can sort of track the broad ideological coalitions. I recommend don't read the news. Actually, just read a few books about Syria. And I think you'll make better sense of events as they unfold than if you try to guess what's happening based on like just what you see on Twitter or what you heard on CNN yesterday or 5 minutes ago.
Yeah, and maybe lastly, is there any prediction you have that we haven't shared, other than, or is it kind of just like business as usual, and it is sort of our conversation in 5 to 10 years on the Middle East will kind of be the same as it is, the same it is today?
Well, I think the demographic changes that are coming to the region will be very important. I think one of the key things is Iran is not economically prosperous. It has lost a lot of its client states. Demographically, it will begin to shrink. So Iran will become a much less important country, not a more important country as time goes on. And, that then means that eventually the Saudi versus Iran, Israel versus Iran sort of cold wars or proxy wars will die down just through Iranian weakness. That doesn't mean the regime there falls. It just means its influence in the broader Middle East will wane and will continue to wane with, ebbs and flows. And I also think that Turkey will become a quite developed country by Middle Eastern standards, and that migration politics will play a big and controversial role. Already, the Syrian refugees in Turkey are a source of friction. Like I said earlier, if we're not promoting Turkish culture and language here, what exactly are we doing? Well, there are millions, I can go to Istanbul and I could not hear Turkish spoken. It would be Arabic, right? Vast demographic reservoir of the Middle East, right next door to a linguistically different, religiously similar, but linguistically different and developed country. Well, to everyone's surprise, Turkey might actually develop some of the same migration politics problems as Europe has. Even, of course, ironically, historically, it was Turkish immigrants in Germany that were often the talking point. So there'll be something very interesting going on here where, Turkish populism in the future might just be anti-immigrant and anti-Arab. And if that happens, I guarantee you, populist anti-immigrant thing will have to go against Muslim ideology and identity, right? Because how else, the religious argument is almost obvious, right? You should take in the refugees that are of your religion, right? Your brothers and sisters, aren't you? This whole Turk thing, this is supposed to be irrelevant in the eyes of God, right? It's not irrelevant in practice. And some non-trivial statements about some simple political futures. Hopefully that gives food for thought.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating way to end. Samo, this is a great discussion. As always, until next time.
Hey everyone, Erik here. At Turpentine, we're building the first media outlet for tech people by tech people. We're the network behind the show you're listening to right now. We have a slate of hit shows across a range of topics and industries, from our AI and investing cluster of podcasts to shows that drive the conversation in tech with the most interesting thinkers, founders, investors, and influencers, like Econ 102 with Noah Smith. We're launching new shows every week, and we're looking for industry-leading sponsors. If you think that might be you and your company, email me at erikaturpentine.co. That's ERIK at turpentine.co, and let's partner together.